privacy issues on the internet, and the cookies and supercookies that track where internet users go on the web. Wall Street Journal technology editor Julia Angwin joins us to talk about legislation concerning how internet users are tracked.
From time to time on the Communicators, we like to introduce you to people who write about and think about telecommunications issues, internet trends, and the public policy behind all of that. Today, we're pleased to introduce you to Julia Angwin. She's a senior technology editor with the Wall Street Journal. She joins us from our New York studio. Ms. Angwin, there's a series in the Wall Street Journal, a rather frequent series in the Wall Street Journal called What They Know. What is that series about?
Hi, thanks for having me on. The series What They Know launched last year, and it's really about privacy in the digital age. We started off by writing about how there were all these third parties on websites that you visit who keep track of what you're doing on those websites and transmit that information and use it for advertising and other purposes. And we quickly found that that was just the tip of the iceberg, and we ended up doing a whole bunch of stories last year on all sorts of techniques people were using to track internet users on the web. And we also did looked into how they're tracking people through apps on iPhone and Android phones. We unveiled a situation where Facebook was inadvertently transmitting information about its users' identities to dozens of companies. And so we ended up basically finding ourselves in a situation where we had more to write about, and so we've ended up continuing the series this year, not with the same branding, but basically covering a lot of the same issues.
Who are some of those third parties who track, and how do they track?
So we found that there are hundreds of companies who are basically in the business of collecting information about how people behave in digital media and selling it. But most often they're selling it to advertisers. So a lot of these companies are advertising companies who either collect the information for themselves to figure out if you go to a website about coffee, then they can give you an ad for coffee. But there's an increasing number of companies that do it as intermediaries. So they would collect information about you going to a website about coffee, and then they would sell that on an exchange or an auction house. And then they might sell it to a whole range of different types of companies that either want to target ads towards you, or in some cases we found that other types of non-advertising companies are experimenting with using this type of data. For instance, we wrote about a life insurance company that was looking at whether some of the data that can be obtained about people's online habits as well as their sort of credit card histories might be a replacement for the blood and urine test in terms of predicting, helping to decide when to give life insurance.
One of those third parties, and first of all, how is it that the third parties are able to track you? Do they install something? Are the internet providers aware that this is being installed on their computers?
Yeah, so essentially what happens is that websites are made up of hundreds of different elements that are provided by all sorts of different companies. So one company might be running some sort of back-end service and then provide some piece of the page. So when you look at a single page, there's actually just a lot of different companies involved in creating different pieces of that page. And some of those pieces are these companies that are basically trafficking in personal data. And so it's very difficult for the websites to police this because they sort of outsource all sorts of pieces of their websites, and so they often don't know what is happening on their website. So for instance, this year we wrote a story about supercookies, which are a type of tracking that is very hard for users to delete. And Microsoft, we found this on Microsoft's website, they didn't know it was there. You know, they just didn't realize it was some old code that was lying around. And this happens a lot, is that there's not a lot of quality control basically in this industry. So there's a lot of people that might find a way to place a piece of code on a website because of they had an advertising or some other kind of relationship at one point, and then it just never gets removed.
What struck me about your series is that seemed to be the case a lot, where you would talk with a company and they'd go, "Oh, we had no idea we were getting that information." It seemed to happen rather frequently.
Yeah, I mean, I think it happened almost in every single case. I can't think of any that weren't like that. And it just, I think a lot of what emerged from our reporting was sort of how unruly this whole marketplace is. That there's just not, people aren't aware of what's going on, and we kind of joke that we become like the privacy police. We just come in and we're like, look, there's this thing happening, and they're like, oh, I didn't realize that was happening, we'll clean it up.
Well, Julia Angwin, if you would, talk about some of the different tracking devices, the cookies, the super cookies, and the beacons that you write about in the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah, so we started off looking mostly at cookies, which are tiny little text files that when you visit a website are downloaded onto your computer. And they basically are just an ID. So it's like a little stamp, your ID number is 123456. And what happens is once you have that ID from one website, if you visit another website that has a relationship with that ID company, they know you're there too. So companies like DoubleClick, which is owned by Google, I think we found that they're on the majority of websites. So on the majority of websites, there's some code from DoubleClick that will notice that you have a cookie with a little DoubleClick ID, and they can put in your file like, oh, now we've seen her in this place, this place, this place, and they have a pretty extensive dossier on all the different websites you've visited. Now, one caveat is all these companies say that they do not have your name and they don't know who you are, and that is generally true, although there are the amount of detail in some of these dossiers makes it possible that you could probably figure out who somebody is. But the theoretical reason for that they're allowed to do this tracking is because it's anonymous. Now, what's happened is cookies were the first thing, and then now there's been an explosion in all sorts of different things. So beacons are little bits of JavaScript, which is a kind of computer code that runs live while you're on a page. Sometimes this beacon will drop a cookie, and sometimes it can actually see where you're moving your mouse. It can read the content on the page and sort of say, oh, it looks like this person is not just on a page with this URL, but is actually reading content about this medical condition. And we'll add that to the dossier, which is like, oh, her mouse is hovering over this section about diabetes. She must be diabetic. So those were some of the techniques. Then we found these super cookies, which is there's a whole range of super cookies, which are essentially other places on your computer that you could drop this same ID. So cookies generally drop their little ID file in a little place in your browser that you can look at where it's all your cookies. But some creative companies have found new places on your computer to store these ID numbers. So in your browser cache files, in your Flash player, which is what plays some of your videos. And so generally all these other storage places for ID numbers are considered super cookies, and they're difficult for users to manage because even if you know to delete your cookies, you might not know to look in all these other places to delete those super cookies.
What are the opt-out provisions that are generally used?
So,
are there any?
You can opt out of all these different, most tracking companies, but there's no law saying they have to offer an opt-out. But if you go to DoubleClick and click on their opt-out button on their privacy page, you will be opted out from receiving targeted advertising from DoubleClick. You don't get to opt out of the tracking, so they are still likely collecting the data about you because in some ways it's just transmitted automatically by your computer, but they basically promise not to use it to deliver targeted ads to you. But not all the companies that we found had opt-outs.
Julia Angwin, how quickly has the sophistication of tracking devices grown, and how close are we to personally identifying people?
Well, this industry has really been exploding. So it really started to take off in 2006, 2007, and in the past 3 years, there's just been hundreds of companies, and at least $5 billion in venture capital has been put into this industry. And so they have come up with all sorts of new creative ways to track people. And there's sort of an insatiable demand on the part of marketers to find out ever more information. So they are getting closer and closer to identification. There was a study released last week that we wrote about, which said that there's a huge amount of identity information on the web, and a lot of it is being sent to these tracking companies. So the researcher went and logged in, created an account at all, almost 200 websites where you could create accounts, and then looked to see how much of that account information that was identifiable, either email or user ID or some other kind of identifying detail, was transmitted to third parties, and it was more than half of them. And once again, this is a situation where, when confronted, most of the companies said they weren't using this data or they didn't know it was being transmitted. But it is becoming harder to make the argument that the tracking is truly anonymous, particularly when you have services like Facebook and Google who really already know who you are. And so when they already know that, and then their little like buttons and stuff are all over the web, they also see you're on those sites. So they actually know who you are and which websites you're on.
What are the benefits to being tracked on the internet, and what's the downside of this?
So the benefits are that you get advertisements that mean something to you. So I'm sure most people who watching this have had the experience of looking at something online, like a sweater or some toy they wanted to buy, and then later seeing an advertisement for something similar, because the advertisers were able to figure out you're interested in that and then provide you with a relevant advertisement. It's also true that your content can be tailored. So when you go to a website, a news website, they might tailor the content based on, they know that in general when you come to this website you've always looked at political articles, so you want more articles about politics. So you do get some personalization there. But at the same time, there's the problems of it are that there's no limits on the reselling of this data. So even if you don't mind targeted ads, you don't really know whether the people collecting that data might resell it to an insurer or to your employer at some point. And also, some people don't like having everything personalized to them. They might want the experience of the internet as sort of a commonplace that's not just one that's totally tailored to you. It can feel like a hall of mirrors where everything you see is a reflection of what people think you are. And oftentimes, at least for me, when I'm doing research about something new, I don't want Google, for instance, to make a guess about what I'm looking for. I really want to see what is out there in the world.
So, Julia Angwin, have you found if you do a Google search or a Bing search, and Google or Bing kind of knows who you are, at least knows who where your computer is located, that some of that research gets tailored towards you?
Yeah, so most people don't realize that their Google searches are unique to them. I often use a plugin or visit a site where I can do sort of anonymous Google searching, and I like to compare the results to what I get when Google knows who I am. And it's often very different. And sometimes I prefer the personalized and sometimes I don't, but I like to be aware that I'm making that choice and to choose which avenue I want to go down.
You've talked about in your writing your personal experience while going online and finding yourself tracked when you put things in your shopping cart.
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes when you put something in your shopping cart, you end up seeing that and then you don't buy it, then that item will follow you around. So I've had this experience where I like to do sort of window shopping online, so I'll put some shoes in my cart, but then I'm really not going to buy them. It's just like my idea of fun. And then those shoes I continue to see for 2 weeks, or one time I was looking for a bathtub, and that bathtub followed me around for a couple of weeks.
Julia Angwin, what about the privacy concerns on this new ability or sophisticated level of tracking online?
Well, I think the concerns are actually Eric Schmidt, chairman of Google, I think expressed them really well. He said, I don't think we really understand the implications, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember the exact quote, but he said, I don't think we really understand the implications of living in a society where everything that we do is being watched, right? Our phones are transmitting our location, and our computers are transmitting everything that we're looking at. And it's becoming a situation where we actually are creating sort of a total surveillance system. Now, it's an imperfect system, and it doesn't always have your name attached, et cetera, but it does have implications, because living in a society where you're always being watched is different than living in a society where you're not, and it can affect your own behavior. If you're it can make you feel paranoid, and so without some limits on the use of that data, I do think that people are going to continue to be fearful about what might happen when they're being monitored.
Are there limits on the use of that data today? Are there any laws against it? Is Congress interested in it? Court cases?
So there is no comprehensive privacy law in the U.S. There are some laws that address specific types of privacy. So there is HIPAA, for instance, which is a fairly well-known health privacy law. There's a law that protects some of your information when you're a college student on campus. A lot of these laws, though, are very limited in scope. So for instance, the law protecting your information when you're a college student ends the moment you graduate. So at that point, the alumni association of your university can sell your name and information to anybody they want. And I'm sure most people have experienced this, that there's some of the more aggressive marketers out there. Similarly, the HIPAA law is very restrictive in terms of medical researchers getting access to data, but is strangely not as restrictive with hospitals sharing it with affiliates. And so these days, when hospitals are part of big companies, they can share your data throughout their system much easier than somebody who's trying to cure cancer can get a hold of a data set. So there's a lot of the current laws we have are, you could say that they're not perfect and aren't really comprehensively looking at our privacy in the digital age.
So is there legislation that's pending or being introduced, Julia Angwin? And what about the courts? Have they spoken out on this issue?
So there is legislation pending. There's several bills in Congress. There's Senator Kerry and Senator McCain introduced a comprehensive privacy bill that would have set some baseline privacy laws about minimizing the sale of data once it's been collected for one purpose and then using it for another purpose. It would have required companies to minimize the amount of data they collect and set up some baseline rules about sort of making companies accountable for their use of data. I don't believe that bill has moved anywhere. There are several other bills that are a little more sectoral. There's do not track legislation, which aims to set up a system where people could choose not to be tracked, and then the companies doing the tracking would have to respect that request. There is also location privacy bills that try to limit the automatic transmission of location from cell phones. So there are a bunch of bills. I haven't seen huge progress with any of them this year, but that might have to do more with the election cycle than with those bills themselves.
This is the Communicators on C-SPAN, and we're talking with Julia Angwin. She is a senior technology editor with the Wall Street Journal. She is also the author of the book Stealing MySpace, The Battle to Control the Most Popular Website in America. That came out from Random House in 2009. She's a Pulitzer Prize winner in 2003 as part of the Wall Street Journal team in explanatory reporting. She is an Illinois native and a University of Chicago and Columbia University graduate. Julia Angwin, back to the medical records issues. For years we've been hearing about the need or the desire on a lot of people's parts to put medical records online electronically. Is the privacy issue, the fact that all these private companies have so much information about us, one of the reasons it hasn't happened?
You know, I think I'm not entirely sure why the medical records issue hasn't happened. I think it's a really complex issue because of the way our healthcare system is set up. But I would say this, that generally people are really anxious to control their own data online, certainly people we talk to, and would want to have their medical records because that is something then they could control. This was Google tried to set up sort of a health vault like this. It didn't work out. I think they were too early. But I think that the issue that I see in writing about this area is that there are all these companies out there that control bits of our data, and I think a lot of people would feel much more comfortable if they controlled it themselves or at least had access to it. Oftentimes you don't have a right to access your data in this country. In Europe you do, for instance. So there's like right now in Facebook has been handing out its files about everybody in Europe because people realize they could use the law to request all the data Facebook has about them. And we don't have a similar law that allows you access to your data. And I think that is becoming maybe more of the flashpoint, which is not so much that you don't want the data to exist, but that you want access to it.
How can people protect themselves if they're concerned that their keystrokes or where they put their mouse on a web page is being tracked? How can people protect that?
Yeah, it's difficult. You can turn off JavaScript. That would, there's a plugin called NoScript, I think, that would turn off JavaScript and would prevent that from happening. However, your experience on a lot of websites would be broken. Similarly, you can turn on cookie blocking or other things like that, and your experience will be diminished. So the problem is that there aren't great ways to prevent this kind of tracking. Most of the instruments we have are very blunt because there are really good uses of these technologies. There's really good uses for cookies. You want to remember what's in your shopping cart. That's why a cookie is what remembers your login at all the sites that you don't want to remember your login to. And so those are the good uses, and it's very difficult to turn off the bad uses while turning on the good, keeping the good uses on. So it's there are tools out there, but all of them are sort of, will make your experience a little bit slower or possibly more complicated.
Julia Angwin, tracking is not only used for advertising purposes, but for law enforcement purposes. How is that done?
So law enforcement have access to some of the types of data that we're talking about. And one thing that we've been writing about recently is how law enforcement has lower standards for getting access to data, from our email accounts or our cell phone location than they do if they wanted to search our homes. So there's a growing concern in the courts about the differing standards for searches and seizures. So we have written about this law, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, passed in 1986, which really aimed to protect digital communications from search, but is really looking outdated these days. And so it allows law enforcement to get a lot of data from us without notifying the subscriber. They can go just to Google or to Verizon and get information about a subscriber without showing probable cause. They just have to show that information would be relevant to an investigation.
And has this come into the courts yet, and have the courts ruled on this case, on this type of intrusion?
What's been happening is that the courts are divided. So most of these requests that government puts for data are going to the federal magistrate judges, and some judges are saying yes and some are saying no, and so there are rulings on both sides, and then oftentimes these cases are sealed, so it's difficult for reporters to know exactly, but a few of them have made it to appeals, and there are decisions on both sides of the issue saying that it's totally fine, or that there needs to be a higher standard for these kind of searches.
Julia Angwin, what kind of resources does the Wall Street Journal put towards telecommunications issues, internet policy, and the public policy that goes with those issues?
Well, the Journal, we're really lucky to have huge resources, I think, by the standards of most newspapers. We have bureaus all over the world. We have a very big Washington bureau. I'm in New York. I have a very small team myself, but I can tap the resources we have across the Journal. So we have people in San Francisco who cover some of these tech companies who've contributed to the series, and we have people in Washington who've contributed. And so it's actually, I would say it's hard to quantify exactly because it's all like a loose network. I don't have I can't say I've pointed these 10 people towards this topic and we're all reporting on it, but generally we have great resources.
Now, something else that you've written about recently, or your team has written about recently, is Face ID tools. What are those?
Mm-hmm. So facial recognition technology has actually come a long way. Right after 9/11, there was a bunch of experiments with facial recognition technology that were just basically flops. They were trying to use facial recognition to identify possible terrorists, and it was too early, and they didn't quite understand some of the parameters for recognizing faces, because recognizing faces is really difficult. The biggest problem is actually just which faces to compare them to. You can get sort of a glimpse of my face and figure out the space between the eyes and the various attributes, but then what database do you look at to find where am I? So in the past 10 years, what's happened is the technology for recognizing the faces has gotten better, and also the databases to which to compare these faces has gotten better. So we wrote a story this summer about how some police are and sheriffs around the country are rolling out these new iPhones that are going to use for facial recognition. And so they're going to, and they also can do iris recognition, which is actually even more accurate. And they're hoping to build a big database and to use this to identify people who might be violating parole or some other issue that they wouldn't have realized when they stopped them for a speeding ticket. But by doing the facial ID, they could pull up a database, see if there's anything else outstanding, and make sure they catch them for that.
Julia Angwin, finally, when you look back at what you've reported on over the last couple of years and some of the trends that you see in internet technology and the use of social networking and all the privacy issues around it, what concerns you the most about this, and where do you see the trends going?
Well, I guess the thing is, I grew up in this era where the internet was so full of promise, right? And at first, I think we all felt this burst of euphoria about, oh my God, I can find other people who have interests like I do, and I can research any topic under the sun. And it's just, the internet has been such an exciting and incredible development in my generation. But I do feel like we're now entering a period of where we're realizing the costs of this great tool, which is that it's not that the tool isn't great, but it does come with some costs. So some of the costs are that you can be constantly surveilled and monitored. There are other costs as well, which is that you're constantly on your BlackBerry at dinner and your spouse is going to divorce you. But the one that I think I'm most concerned about for society right now is just how do we limit the possible harms, because we don't want to live in surveillance state. We don't want to live in Libya where they were keeping files on every dissident. I don't think we're anywhere near that, but the tools are available, and if we don't sort of rein them in, I do think that bad actors could use them that way.
Julia Angwin is the senior technology editor for the Wall Street Journal. You can read her reporting and her team's reporting online at the Wall Street Journal. Thank you for being on the Communicators.
Thank you.